all will get A++ here, so nobody has to worry about anything.
One more here.
Yes, one of them, we run short.
Okay. Our theme is, Walter is with us too. Walter, come, you get
Pencil here too.
a little thing too here. Is there a chair for Walter?
Yep.
Walter, there's your chair. Your woman didn't come, huh?
She might be a little late. She was doing a Valentine's Day party.
Oh, Valentine. Happy Valentine to all of
She
you.
does social work for people.
Really?
She has a calling, like you told me about.
Yeah.
Too late. Nobody told me about early in life.
You have a calling. Walter, you always had a calling.
Well, I didn't know it.
Come sit. Well, these are the best
Now he
callings.
tells me.
The best callings that you don't know. These are the best callings.
Yes.
Okay.
Intuitive.
Very good. We want to talk about, in these 6 weeks, the new social encyclical letter on human development. I had a long discussion about this, and Father Ken said it was too difficult for people, and they would be horrified. We should make it simpler. So I don't know anymore what we did. I think we said something about the development of the people and political life. That was the thing. But nevertheless, Benedict XVI has written a new encyclical. A few months ago it came out. And last semester we wanted to say something about it, but Father Ken said the priests hadn't read it yet. So therefore we had to wait for the next semester, but now they still haven't read it. So let me tell a long story about this. When I started teaching with the Jesuits in Baltimore, I taught for 3 years with the Jesuit brothers, in Loyola College. And one day I wanted to do the social encyclical letters. And they said, you cannot do this. You will lose all your friends in Baltimore. I said, this cannot be, so let's try it. And so I did not lose all friends in Baltimore, but there was something against these encyclical letters. And I said, you are writing them. They are all written by the Jesuits. So therefore, particularly the Jesuits in Frankfurt do this. So therefore, you are the Jesuits. Now, why can't I teach them? So there is something strange, question mark, about these social encyclical letters. And I don't want to prejudge it. We can think about it together, why there is this opposition. And I don't think, that they locked the doors. There's a sign of this opposition. I think that was just stupidity or whatever. But they are not really behind it. And I don't know why. Because this is a bishop here. The bishop is in communion with the Bishop of Rome. So, that's a specific thing. And so if the Bishop of Rome says something, they should at least listen to it. But they don't. So, and why not? That's the thing. So maybe the other side, the political life, and we want to go to 2010 now, our political life is in a bad shape, at this moment, at this very moment, because the old neoliberalism, pre-Roosevelt, has driven us into a horrible crisis, and the post-Roosevelt liberalism cannot pull us out. You could not be in a worse situation if you only have liberalism. So therefore, that the church offers another theory contrary to liberalism, and that is called solidarism, S-O-L-I-D-A-R-I-S-M, solidarism. And this solidarism is supposed to be between liberalism on one side and socialism on the other side. So you don't have to become a socialist, but you don't have to remain a liberal. Every night Fox News says Obama is a socialist and so on and so on. So this terrible fear of socialism. So what the Pope really says is, look, I have a theory which is in the middle between the right and the left. And this is called solidarism, S-O-L-I-D-A-R-I-S-M. And so this is also what this encyclical is about. It is not totally new because it celebrates the remembrance of Paul VI, Progressio Populorum. The Latin words are always the first words of the encyclical. That is how the encyclical is known. So Paul VI wrote this social encyclical, Progressio Populorum.
Would you spell it?
Progressio, it's Latin, P-R-O-G-R-I-S-S-I-O. Progressio Populorum is the people, so progress of the people. It was the only encyclical letter in which ever a pope talked about revolution. So that was an outstanding thing. Popes are not revolutionary people, and so that was unusual. Now, this celebrates the remembrance. So that was, 40 years ago. It is always after 40 years. So the first encyclical was called Rerum Novarum. New things are happening. That means 50 years after Marx, the popes suddenly discovered that something was wrong with capitalism and that people were suffering tremendously. And so then they started to do their own version. No, we don't want to go with Marx, and we don't want to go on with this liberalism, so therefore we have solidarism. And then 40 years later was the encyclical Quadragesimo Anno. That means 40 years later. And that was in 1931. And that encyclical was used by the New Dealers under Roosevelt. They were looking, for some kind of orientation, and they found this encyclical and took out of it another principle. Not the principle of solidarity, but the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity. So what Roosevelt said, he didn't know really what he was doing. When he had this speech in which he talked about this, the New Deal, when he used that word the first time, he did not have any idea. I mean, he did not have built up theory about this. He had a cabinet and people and brain trust people, and some of them were of the far right. There was a capitalist there who had shipped 200 workers in the desert and left them there to starve to death. So there was a real right-wing guy. And then he had social workers on the other side who brought up much more left-wing ideas. And so he got those two things together, and out of this came this New Deal. But the New Deal was liberalism. We were always a liberal country. We were always a middle class, always a bourgeois country. We never had nobility here. Lord Baltimore stayed for 3 years and left. There was nobility in Canada. There was nobility also in Mexico, but we didn't. And so the bourgeoisie has a philosophy. It has a theory how the world is supposed to go, politically, economically, and so on. And that is called liberalism. And this liberalism comes from Protestantism. It comes from Calvin. And it's very individualistic, very atomistic. So suddenly we are hit by this unbelievable depression in 1929 and the crash of the stock market. And this liberalism, this theory was not enough to handle this anymore. So therefore, Roosevelt, and that was an ingenious type of a thing, modified it socially by saying, liberalism is right, you should take care of yourself, you should have initiative, and so on and so on. But then there was the question, Mark, what if it doesn't work? What if I can't find a job? What if I cannot go to school? And so on and so on. And that is where they took out of the encyclical Quadragesimo Anno this principle of subsidiarity. It means do what you can, but if the system doesn't work, then the next higher unit has to come. So if your family cannot help you, the city cannot help you, then the state must help you. If the state cannot do it, then the federal government does it. And this is what's happening now. If next year we don't get federal help in the place here, we have to fire half of our people. So this is true for all the other universities too. So the universities have practically been federalized. And without this federalization, they could not work. And so General Motors has been federalized, and so the car industry. The banks have been federalized by Bush already. So this, that is, the crisis which we have, and which we had, in 1929. And so, therefore, Roosevelt said, now we have to do, the state has to do something, the federal government has to do something. To be liberal means to keep, think of the Tea Party now, to be liberal means to keep the government small, to make the government into a night watchman. It is there for military services and it's there for the defense of the country, but otherwise it should leave its hand out of people's life. It should leave it to what Adam Smith called the invisible hand, and that is the market. It sounds theological and was Providence originally, but then it became the market. So the market should do it. But what Bush was told, and we just discussed it the last semester, was that the market collapsed. And he went to the people, and there was the only honest hour in his life, And he said, I have been told, you know, that we are at the brink of total disaster. And therefore he began to federalize the banks and then the industries, and then Obama went on with this. So what that means is subsidiarity. So suddenly even the President Bush, you know, went over to the Roosevelt thing. Why had they left it? And that is Reagan, you know. You know that Reagan was a labor union leader. He was a man on the Roosevelt side first. And so was Charles Coughlin here, who then turned into a fascist. They went along with the New Deal, and then they thought that this horrible crisis of 1929 was only a short illness. And then we got over it, and it will not come back again. Therefore, we don't need that subsidiarity anymore. We can go back behind Roosevelt, before Roosevelt, Hoover, and so on, and the other Roosevelt, and so on. So, and that is why with Reagan, and a little bit before already, we turned over to this pure liberalism again without any social modification. And we saw that, of course, in New Orleans, the disaster where the president came in too late with federalization, and therefore the whole people still talk today, you have so much technology, and why the hell did that become such a disaster? Well, it became such a disaster because of things in the head. That means that principle of subsidiarity was missing. So when the president got all the news about the warm water, and therefore the storm would be horrifying, he still thought that the two states should take care of it, that the city should take care of it, the buses there, the schools, they should all take care of themselves. That's liberalism. Instead of giving the order from the Supreme Commander and to say, we have these pontoons, we have this amphibious thing standing in the desert, you know, send 3,000-4,000 of them into New Orleans, 200 people on each of these boats, they can swim and they can drive and so on, instead of 3 helicopters flying from one roof to the other and catching a mouse or a cat or whatever, yes.
Well, that department that was supposed to take care of that was more efficient at one time, but it became a patronage thing for for Bush. He gave that over to a party hack to run as a patronage thing.
Right.
So
I'm quite sure.
No competence at all.
Yeah, I'm quite sure, you know, that there are other issues besides that thought of subsidiarity, namely that there are issues where the smaller unit cannot help itself any longer, and therefore you have to come in. And so, but then the election, I think the American people, we did the right thing. We went from this pre-Roosevelt liberalism to a post-Roosevelt liberalism, and we thought that would do the job. And now the disappointment and the falling of the statistics for the president and the approval and so on shows that people are disappointed. Some people are disappointed. It's particularly the job number. He doesn't get the jobs up. I just make a joke. I had a lot of workers in the last 4 weeks, you know, carpenters and painters and so on. And I said, if every American citizen would employ so many people as I did, the unemployment rate would go to 5%. But we don't. And so it is probably not the solution to it. So this is the terrible thing now, because we have nothing then, liberalism. The other thing, you know, to go to social democracy or Labor Party or whatever, we are not at the point, masses of us are not at the point where we want to do that. And so we are a little bit caught. And the most tragic thing is that, of course, the New Deal of Roosevelt did not rescue capitalism, but what rescued capitalism was the war. And so when you hear them now, a war against Iran, they think, some express it that way, if we would have that war against Iran, we would win the next election, because they would not throw out a war president or whatever. But that is a tiny issue there. In reality, it means if we get a war, then our New Deal will work, which we have now. The New Deal which we have now, together with a big war, bigger war than just Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever. So it has to spread further, and then we could rescue capitalism. And that is the great danger. Do we really want to do that, you know? Do we really know that we are in this situation? I think most Americans don't even know what the President Bush heard when he was told we are at the brink, you know. because the countermeasures were taken very fast. So the federalizations were going into the banks and industry very fast. So therefore we didn't get over the brink all the way, you know. But the great danger is now that now first of all that war danger, that's one thing. But the other thing is that if we could normalize and we could maybe get the unemployment down from 10.2, let's see, to 6 or whatever, that then people would say, now we can go back to the Chicago School and to Friedman and so on, and we can deregulate again and we can privatize again and so on. That was the most disastrous of all things, because then, the federal government will not have the means anymore to federalize further and will have to let a lot of banks, middle range and small banks, collapse completely. A lot of the industries collapse completely. So, and it will not get another $1 trillion from China. They have already said that they will only give smaller loans, and that only if we get the greed down. But they do not mean the greed, you know, as a vice of a particular person, as Dickens describes it, you know, in his Christmas story or whatever. It is what the liberation theologians call structural sins. That means the greed has become objectivated, so that the whole machinery of the market has become an objectivated greed. So it's not enough to go to the Wall Street and say to the individual bankers there, you know, or industrialists, you don't be so greedy or whatever. Don't give yourself so many bonuses and so on. That would not help. So it would be much better, you know, if we would go on with the federalization, if we would not allow the banks to pay things back for the moment. That would mean also that the federal government would keep control over the banks and the industry. It would control the payments. It would not allow the tremendous bonuses. It would ask for reasons why these bonuses are supposed to be paid and so on. And this discipline, that could make us possible to go through the change more equally and less erratically and catastrophically. So this is where we stand now. But the question is, you know, how many people are fully aware. And I mean, the president told us, Obama and his wife and others, you know, that people are not aware, you know, how serious the whole thing is. And if you have 10% unemployed, you still have 90% employed. So it can be that you are living in a neighborhood and you are the only unemployed person. And that gives, you know, the illusion of stability or whatever. So all that works together. So what we want to do is to look into this encyclical letter. Let me say something right away, and that is that we also must be critical, right, to what the Pope says now, to this encyclical. I got a letter from a famous theologian in Montreal, and he said, you know, he's an old man and he has a hard time to travel, and he was just in Germany and gave a talk and had a hard time to come back again. But he said, you know, all over Europe, people have the feeling that this encyclical there sounds very much like Pius X. Now, whoever grew up in the Catholic environment, Pius XII was one of the pious popes of the 19th century. They all had the name Pius. And Pius X issued a document which was called the Syllabus. And the Syllabus contained all the condemnations of modern things, not only socialism, but also liberalism and relativism and all kinds of names. Everything modern since the Reformation and the Renaissance was all condemned. I don't know if you're aware that we had a horrible crisis around 1900 here in this country, because there was a movement which was called Americanism, and it was taking place particularly in the Diocese of Baltimore and Washington and so on. And there were people who wanted to make the church more modern. They wanted to make the church more American. They wanted Americans to be open for the values of the American Constitution. They wanted to produce a situation in which Catholics could also feel good as American citizens, and where American citizens could feel good as Catholics, and there should not be any split. And of course, this syllabus, you know, condemned everything, and because of that, this Americanism was called modernism. It was called a form of modernism and was considered to be a heretical movement. And priests and bishops along the Atlantic coast were horribly punished by this, and a lot of pain was suffered by sisters and by monasteries and with Jesuits and so on. So in the meantime it has blown over, and I was called over here, and it's a little bit about my background, by the Jesuits in Baltimore, because I was supposed to help to bring the Anglican Church, which is called the Episcopalian Church, and the Roman Catholic Church together. And at that time, the priests, these wonderful Jesuit priests in Baltimore, they walked all day long with these Anglican priests, and it was very close. But they did not only do that, they also wrote books about the American Constitution and the whole Human Rights and Civil Rights Declaration, which was all modern, and tried to build a bridge between that and the church, because that syllabus was like the Taliban's. You could almost say, that the Taliban's, or more conservative circles, and my friend Dustin is a Muslim, that these what they go through today, this struggle for identity against modernity, that is what the Roman Catholic Church went through in the 19th century, in the 17th century, in the 16th century, and so on. And so it is a fundamental principle, this antagonism between the religious and the secular. And we want to get that together here in the form of this encyclical letter, which is a religious document, and on the other side, American politics, which is secular politics. And what this theologian then wrote to me is, so nothing has changed. Benedict XVI, thunders in his encyclical letter against modern relativism, and it's the same thing what Pius X did. But he said one thing has changed. And that one thing what has changed is that the Catholics are not afraid any longer to disagree with the Pope. And so they just don't take it anymore. Now, what does relativism mean? Let's explain all these words, because sometimes we think we know these words, and then when we look at it, then we don't know them. So it's one of our tasks is to clarify some of these things which the Pope wants, and then how this can be applied to our present situation. And I wanted to show movies. We can show there's a movie called Wall Street or whatever, or we can take some of what we did the last time of more there, because he is a Catholic and he grew up here and he knows the home territory, and he can show us what the family is like and what the industry was like, and his father and grandfather, they were all Ford Motor Company people and so on. So then we can get these two things together a little bit. We can analyze further what Moore says, and then see what this solidarism, if this could be of any help now, because we need all the help we can get, When you see the despair of these people of the what is it, Tea Party, and so on, already the name, what is this really supposed to mean, this Tea Party? The Tea Party was part of the American Revolution, which was not a revolution. And it was not called a revolution up to 1800. And it was simply a struggle between the American colonial bourgeoisie in Boston and the English bourgeoisie in Manchester. And the American colonial bourgeoisie didn't have the same rights. They couldn't sit in Parliament in London and co-determine their own fate, and were supposed to pay taxes. Then they made this gesture, throwing all the tea in the water, whatever. So, but what does that have to do with this now? We don't want to emancipate ourselves from the British bourgeoisie any longer. They should emancipate themselves from us, because they have to do everything what we tell them. So that is obviously not the thing. And there is no King George or whatever to make a revolution against. So what should this idea do now at this moment, So when they shout and scream, they say, that the state takes over health insurance and so on, and socialism is coming and so on. So they're somewhat on the right, but the name Tea Party doesn't really fit. So nevertheless, But relativism, right? So what does that mean? What these people say is the Pope shouts against modern relativism, and that is the same thing like Pius X with his syllabus, where he shouts at the whole modernity as a threat to face, and everybody who goes along with this modern stuff, loses his eternal life, and so on and so on. So, by the way, let me finish that thing with Baltimore there. So it went very well with the English Church. That's the Anglican Communion, the Bishop of Canterbury, Anglican Communion, and so it was very close, and there was also the idea they could keep their marriage and all this. They invited me because I had worked on the same thing with the Lutherans. 2 Lutheran ministers had come over into the Catholic Church, and they were allowed to keep their marriages. It didn't work. Nothing came from it. There was no reunion of Lutherans and Catholics in Germany. And so it's very questionable when you go to Three Rivers, where I take my students all the time. They don't take advantage. They don't want to join the Roman Catholic Church. They had an abbot coming in last week from a Roman Catholic Benedictine monastery, and this abbot helps them to solve their problems and so on. But they still don't want to subordinate themselves under the Bishop of Rome. So, well, what really happened was they began to ordain women, and it went apart. Then they ordained homosexuals. There's a bishop who's a homosexual and he has a partner. And so that made it wider. Then they blessed homosexual unions and so on. Now the American Episcopalian Church has split off from the Anglican Communion in Canterbury. And so it's some kind of a heresy thing. And they are struggling among themselves here. And the Pope has opened up a diocese, which he does for military personnel, and they can move into that diocese if they want. So that means whole parishes, Episcopalian parishes, with their priests, could go into the Catholic Communion and would be full-fledged priests and could keep their marriages and their families and so on. But it's not entirely clear how many of the American Episcopalians would do that, but they go through tremendously painful processes, and it's chaotic in this church. So, and they need all the prayers which they can get. Okay, so but we don't want to talk about in between the church relationship, but rather this on one side, the Pope in Rome, the Patriarch of the West, writing these encyclical letters, on the other side, American political life, secular life, and so on. And so this word relativism is very important. The opposite of relativism is absolutism. So
what word was it?
Absolutism.
Absolute.
A-B-S-O-L-U-T-I-S-M. Absolutism. So we have the 3 Abrahamic religions. All 3 of them are ethical monotheism, that's called. So what came into the world through Abraham and what was taken up by the prophet Muhammad, peace be with him, and what Jesus of Nazareth took up, this is all ethical monotheism. And these ethical norms come from God. That means God spoke. That means Yahweh Amar in Hebrew. He spoke. And what he says has absolute validity. That's called an absolute ethics. What is the opposite of an absolute ethics? It's situation ethics. That means you decide according to the circumstances what is good and bad. So you would say, okay, you should not kill, but there are circumstances when you have to kill. Somebody kills somebody, you execute him, so then you kill him. Or you are attacked, you have to defend yourself. Today on television you can see how thousands of our troops are at this moment marching against the Taliban. So since Gratian, the Codex Iuris Canonici of the Roman Catholic Church has decided that killing is killing, it's bad, but if the prince decides that there is an enemy and that this enemy has to be killed, then it's not murder, it's just killing, like a cat or dog or whatever. So that means it's a church document. That's the beginning of the canon law, which all our bishops study here and then become bishops. So this is then situation ethics. And you have a modern ethics, which is situation ethics, and that is called relativism. So that is what the Pope really condemns. Now, there was this great Paul Tillich, a Protestant theologian, and he would say that all norms are really variable, but one is absolute, and that is you must love. So in one situation, love may tell you that you cannot commit adultery. But in another situation, love may dictate to you that you can commit adultery because of certain circumstances. In some cases, you are forbidden to kill, but in other cases, love demands you to kill, for instance, in order to rescue your child or your wife or whatever. So you have something in between. The Pope is an absolutist. Not really all the way, but he stands up for absolutism, and that is religion. And on the other hand, there's the bad world on the other side, and they are all relativistic. Not only in terms of norms, but they have this, what is this called when you go in the cafeteria style? The Pope talks about a cafeteria style of religion. So you take from it what you want to, and the rest you leave, and take a little bit here, a little bit there. So that's the same relativism as far as the interpretation of reality is concerned, as the other one, the orientation of action. So the Pope fights against this relativism. So we can, in order to make it clear, we always want to start with the reading. So let me just read a few things what that sounds to you like. So there is the book Exodus, of course, and Exodus means there is Judaism is characterized by revelation experiences, by two revelation experiences. One is the liberation of the Hebrews from their Egyptian slaveholders, and the other one is the experience of Mount Sinai, where God gives those two tablets, and these tablets are now in the tabernacle of every synagogue, and there is an eternal light burning in front of it. And so if you do comparative religion, you will see that they have the two tablets, the Ten Commandments in the tabernacle, and we have the bread and the wine. That means we have replaced the law by a person, by Jesus of Nazareth. And for this we have been excommunicated from the synagogue in 114 in Jaffa, and the excommunication still stands. As the Roman Catholic Church has excommunicated Luther, Calvin, and everybody who follows them, so we, the Christians, are excommunicated from the synagogue since 114, and particularly for our central belief, namely Jesus, the Messiah, and the Son of God. That is what is unacceptable as far as Judaism is concerned. It is also unacceptable as far as the Islamic community Ummah is concerned. So that is where the tensions are. And the Christians have to see how they will formulate this, what that means, the Son of God, and what that means, the Messiah. Yahweh's Messiah and Yahweh's Son. It can mean many things. It means something in the Hebrew language. It means something else in the Greek language. So these are things we are not concerned with here. But what we are concerned with is the Pope's absolutism, which he holds on to, which is his strength, and for which now the great theologian Montreal says one thing has changed. The Catholics are not afraid anymore to disagree with the Pope, for instance, about this issue of relativism. There is something, of course, we want to, look at both sides and how they are thinking and what the Pope stands for. We want to understand him fully. That means his constitution. And we want to understand the constitution of a modern man. If you say, that the circumstances, the situation is so important, then you could say that these 10 commandments were spoken into a certain historical situation. And in this situation, they were valid. But if this situation changes, as it does all the time in history, they may not be valid any longer. That means the truth has a time core. The truth does not always remain the same. For the Pope, the truth has no time core. And for the modern man, also the truth has a time core. There you see one of the many, many, many contradictions between modern people and the Pope. That's why in Europe they call him the Taliban. They think that he is the same rubric like them. One has to differentiate more, but nevertheless. So just that we see the text here once. We don't want to do it in Hebrew, but we do it in English, and that may not be right all the time, but we do it as good as we can. Then God spoke all these words. So this, Yahweh Amar, that is fundamental. Can you still hold on to it? Does the rabbi hold on to it? Does the imam really hold on to it? So, and so God spoke. And he spoke into a certain situation. But what he speaks is also valid in all the following situations. Because you can, of course, dissolve all these revelations by saying that they were time-bound. So let me give you an example. Somebody in Judaism may say, okay, book Leviticus, a man cannot lay with a man like with a woman. Death penalty. Now, if you are a liberal rabbi, you will bring the circumstances in. You will bring the situation in which that was said. And you will say, what the book Leviticus really means is that male temple prostitution in the Near East was forbidden, but not homosexuality, number one. Or, at that time, people had no appreciation yet for the sexual love between the same gender. But in the meantime, we have changed, and now we can appreciate the beauty of this relationship as well as the Greeks did, for instance. So, therefore, the situation has changed, and therefore the norm has changed. That is relativism. And for the Pope, this relativism stabs him right into the heart. That means it dissolves things. And if you are liberal about these things and say, well, it was just for temple prostitution, it was not so, therefore we can bless homosexual unions today, in spite of the fact once there was the death penalty on this. Or they would say, there is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the 5 cities, and there was abomination, and therefore God sent 2 angels, one messenger, Islamic people say rightly. The messenger said, that Abraham will have a son, which will Isaac, and after 9 months, and Sarah laughs herself to death. And then the 2 others go on to Sodom, and then there's this collective bargaining of Abraham, where Abraham says to God, and he speaks very freely before God, and says, you are a God of justice. You don't want to do any injustices in Sodom, where my nephew Lot is living with his family, and so on. And so if there are 50 just people in Sodom, will you rescue them? And the messenger says, yes, we will rescue them. And he goes down to, 20, it goes down to 10 or whatever. In the end, there is only one just person in Sodom, and that is Lot. And Lot is only just because he was drunk when he had incest with his 2 daughters. It's a miserable place, Sodom, there, and so on. So, but now, what do they say, the liberals say now? Or the relativists. The relativists say it was not homosexuality. First, the name does never appear. And by the way, Muhammad was so sensitive that he left out the incest story. He stops short of the incest story. So, but the thing, the relativism comes in there with this. For instance, one thing which is totally forgotten in that thing is the children, of course. Abraham does not bargain for the children, because certainly the children were innocent in Sodom and were annihilated together with all the others. But what the interpreters say now is it was not the homosexuality which counted, but gang rape. They stood in masses before the door there, and Lot wanted to give his 2 virgin daughters. He had other daughters which were married already with the homosexuals, so they were all bisexual. So so he wanted to give his daughters, they were wonderful virgins, and they didn't want to have the daughters. They wanted to have those 2 messengers, foreigners, and so that is then, that would be a relativistic interpretation. So one would say, if it had not been gang rape, it would have been all right. And then you can draw the conclusion today, as some rabbis do, the liberal rabbis or the reformed rabbis, and bless homosexual unions. It is easier for them to bless these unions than to okay mixed marriages or assist the marriage between a Jew and a Catholic, or a Jew and a Protestant, or a Jew and a Muslim, and so on. So, okay, so I mean, we see that the whole thing of the Pope is serious. We see what he wants, but of course he himself was never absolutistic. So in the confession, the Father Confessor says, how many times did you commit this sin, in order to see if it is habitual or not. He wants to ask, he asks for the circumstances in which it was done, because the circumstances could mitigate the gravity of the crime. So all this are relativistic elements, and not to speak, of allowing army chaplains, to assist the killing spree there in the battlefield, or somebody to execute somebody, and so on. So the absolutism of the three Abrahamic religions was never without a certain element of relativism. It always related itself to particular situations and was then also modified according to these things. But nevertheless, one could say, so it is like an ideal continuum. You have absolutism on one side, you have relativism on the other side, but there is no pure relativism. There is no pure absolutism. It is just a continuum, but you approach these extremes. And the Pope approaches this extreme of absolutism, and Hans Küng, approaches this other pole of relativism. And so, therefore, the Pope will say, you cannot teach as a Catholic theologian, Hans Küng, because you are relativists, in spite of the fact that Hans Küng, holds on to some absolutes, and so does Paul Tillich, and so on. So it's what the struggle is about. Now, there is something, like a pure situation ethics. There was in the 60s and the 70s, where no absolute is left anymore. And in their practical behavior, people may very well act as if there was no absolute left anymore, and so on. So that is what the Pope is all about. So, and we have now the following problem. We have a modernity which is relativistic, and we have a Pope who is absolutistic, and then under the onslaught of modernity, now on all religions, first on Christianity, which produced it, by the way, and then against Judaism, and now against Islam, and so on, then these groups are splitting in themselves, because some Muslims emphasize identity, bin Laden, for instance, and others, like Ramadan, Professor Ramadan, would say, we want to have a European Islam, and we are open to modernity, and so on. And then they get in trouble with each other, and one says, you are a traitor, you betray, Look at the letters of bin Laden, which he writes to the different governments, the government of the king of Saudi Arabia, you ally yourself with these pagan outside, and these non-believers, occupy Mecca and Medina, and so on, and you tolerate all this, you are traitors to the Holy Quran, and so on. And the same thing, of course, you have in Catholicism between the Pope and Hans Küng, and we are good friends, Hans Küng, and they visit each other. Hans Küng visits him, and in Castel Gandolfo and in Bavaria, where the Pope has his vacation place, and so on. But they don't move one step further because of issues where the Pope would say, Hans, you have become too liberal Protestant. You have become a liberal Protestant in your Christology and in your ecclesiology, and so on. And this is all relativistic. And therefore, Hans Küng is not excommunicated, but he can also read the Mass, but he cannot preach. And then the same thing is true, that Brockman, a liberation theologian, was the head of the UN, And you also know that Aristide, was the head of the state of Haiti, So all these people, are then under suspicion by the Pope, If you have a right-wing priest in Poland, there's no suspicion, But when you have one who is in the liberation theology and on the left or whatever, then the Pope is very... So he tried his best to destroy the liberation theologians the basic Christian communities.
Isn't that a very specific category, isn't it? The suspicion of heresy, isn't it?
Yeah, right. So we have two things. Schism, right? Schism. Since 800, the Council of Frankfurt, and then on, there is a schism between the seven patriarchs in the East and the Patriarch of the West, without any interruption. A schism. A schism is a split in the organization. They honor the Bishop of Rome because he is the successor of Peter, but they think he is one among equals, primus inter pares, and the Pope thinks he is the first under unequals, and therefore they don't get along with each other. So that does not touch the dogma or the morality or the sacraments or the vows or whatever. But all Protestant groups, from Luther, Calvin, Zwingli on, they are all heresies. So Catholic means Greek word katholen, the whole. They claim that they have the whole of the Christian faith. And then they look at Hus or Wycliffe or Luther and think they took a little piece out of it, like the idea of justification, Luther, or the idea of vocation, or the idea of predestination, and so on. And so they only have heresies, a little part of the whole. And for that, they are excommunicated. And it stayed that way up to now. So that's a difference between a heresy and what it's not only a schism with Hans Küng, it's a heresy. That means Hans Küng has attacked the infallibility dogma of 1880 because of deficiencies in the dogmatization process. And there is a historian who has described what happened in the council, also a Swiss like Küng. And he has discovered that the Pope was schizophrenic. His illegitimate son, the Pope's son, was the cardinal who conducted the council. It was 1870. All the French and German bishops left because of the start of the Prussian-Russian war, which the Prussians won by marching into Paris. And the American bishops left too, and nobody knows exactly why the hell they were leaving, but they left too. So then there were only those left who agreed to the infallibility dogma and the supremacy oath. Now, on the other side, you always have to, you have to see the constitution of both sides. This is very important if we don't want to fall into the trap of American subjectivism. It's one of our characteristics is an extreme subjectivism. What is a terrorist? And we have made up a terrorist. That a terrorist also a father and a mother and a daughter and a lover, and that he spent 20 years in a refugee camp in Syria or whatever, because he was driven out with his family out of Jewish Palestine and so on. So all these things make up the constitution of this man. And we take just one thing out. He's a terrorist. He blew himself up in the last month. That he blows himself up, for instance, in order to go into paradise, because this miserable world in which he grew up is just unbearable, and so on. All these little details, And what the army forgets when they make this profile of these people is, how did he become a terrorist? What the army always forgets is itself. When you drive a car, you have a blind spot. They have a blind spot. They don't see themselves. For instance, their presence in the Holy Territory, in the Haaretz, may be the main reason why the terrorists become terrorists. And Abu Ghraib may be one of the reasons, and Guantanamo Bay may be one of the reasons, you see. That all belongs to the constitution of the terrorist. And the constitution of the American psychology officer is such that it overwhelms that picture, and he cannot really see there. And when he cannot see him really, he cannot effectively fight him. And this is tragic. This is really tragic. So what we have to educate ourselves to is to develop a theory of things in which we appreciate the constitution of the object and are aware at the same time of the constitution of the subject who theorizes it. The British have the same thing, we inherit from them or whatever, this extreme subjectivism, and then Hitler imitated the British thing, and followed the British propaganda, and the German propaganda was as miserably subjective during the Second World War as the British propaganda had been in the First one. So, and you can have war, if you don't want to see the constitution of the other. But if you want to make peace, you have to. And the same thing is with discourse. The only thing what you have to do in order to have war with Iran is break up all the discourses. We have already no ambassador there. We have an embassy We have an embassy in Syria, but there is no ambassador for years and years and years. So the only thing what you need in order to make war is to break off discourse. Or if you have a discourse, not being aware of your own constitution, who you are, and not being aware of the other constitution. See, even if I take my blood pressure, the subject and the object are identical, but it is possible that as I measure myself, that my excitement about my measuring changes already my blood pressure. That happens to every scientist. Even if somebody studies the atom or whatever, when he looks at the atom behaves differently from the way when he does not look at it. And so this is with the observation of animals, of ourselves, and so on and so on. So, and if you take to it that we are all naturalists as secular people, university people, we are naturalists. That means we look at ourselves on the basis of brain physiology and robotics and so on. We look at ourselves as if we were computers, which are constructed, reconstructed, repaired, and then abandoned or whatever. Can you imagine that when people have this type of a reified consciousness and of themselves and then also of everybody else, what that means, they cannot see the construct of the other, what did we call it, the constitution of the other, or their own constitution adequately. It is distorted on both sides. Well, let me go back to this thing. What the Pope says is that this document, that the Council decided that that the Decalogue and the covenants of Judaism are also valid for Christianity. So he thinks that this chapter 20, Exodus, is absolute morality. And what does it say? Then God spoke all these words. He said, I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of Israel, of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no gods except me. And so now, if this is all true, if this has been challenged by higher criticism, for instance, if there ever were real slaves, if Joshua ever took over Canaan or whatever, if he ever blew the horn and the walls of Jericho fell down. The walls of Jericho had fallen down 1,000 years before Joshua came or whatever. You have the whole problem of the attack of modernity, right? And there is something with us as Americans. See, nobody had a monkey trial in 1925 or whatever, with this, this high school teacher or whatever. And still, recently, the last election, there were 12 Republicans who said they didn't believe in evolution. You don't believe in evolution. You know evolution. You believe in creation, but you know evolution, if you really know it. On the basis of sufficient evidence. It doesn't mean that you know all. There are holes, in evolution, of course, many holes. But in the meantime, the evidence for evolution has increased in such a way that one cannot simply deny it any longer and put the ichthyosaurians together with mankind, whom they would have eaten for breakfast. We would never have been here if they had not died 150 million years before we came. That was very providential that they died. Otherwise, we wouldn't have made it, because they were flying, they were walking, they were swimming. Wherever we would have been, they would have eaten us for breakfast. We wouldn't have had a chance. Okay, so nevertheless, so what we have to differentiate, you know, between the religious side and that secular side in which we do our politics and so on. And there are worlds apart, and I think in Europe people are more aware of that. But don't underestimate ourselves. Today I go to my little bloodsucker there who controls my blood spoiler or whatever, and she suddenly says, I'm an atheist. She had read that article about me there in the newspaper, and she said, you know, I'm very interested in this, religious and the secular side, because I'm on the secular side and I'm a total atheist. And there is a woman, you know, studied biology, and she is, what is that in the drugstores there?
Pharmacy?
Pharmacist. She's a pharmacist, you know. And so the sciences which she studied brought her to the point where she was an atheist. Now, I didn't talk any longer, you know, what that means and all this, you know. But we have them all over the place, the people, you know. There is the representative of Catholicism in Borges Hospital, and she, in the middle of the year, she converts to something else. I mean, she converted, I don't know to what, but she left the Catholic position, and then she goes on, you know, is a Catholic chaplain who's not Catholic anymore. So there are the strangest things that are happening. And I think what would be good, you know, as a first step would simply be honest. To be honest and not being frightened to be called an atheist. She was not frightened, and that was good, you know. She could simply say, all right, I'm an atheist. And she says in the middle of a Catholic hospital, you know. And that this Catholic hospital is so tolerant that she has an atheist there, that's also beautiful. Right? So I think honesty is important, and it's also a matter of psychological hygiene for mental health. Because, you know, to walk around and be one thing and have to be another one, and so that's very hard for the psyche apparatus. So let me just read that a little bit of this more there that we have this. So you shall have no gods except me. That's idolatry. And every sin comes from idolatry. Every rabbi would agree to that. Idolatry is the worst of all sins, because if you idealize your country, right or wrong my country, right or wrong my country or whatever, love it or leave it and so on, then you have already murdered a lot of people and so on. So, or if you, you know, idealize the car or sex and car and career or whatever, or you, you know, it means what Max Weber said, we are polytheistic. That means we, like the Romans, on Sunday we are monotheistic, but during the week we spend a lot of time for porno, a lot of time for war, a lot of time for business and so on. These are the real gods. These are the real forces. They had all poetical names once. Pluto was the god of business of Wall Street, you know, and Mars was the god of war and so on. But it counts how much money we spent for war or for Wall Street, how much time we spent and so on. That is really what makes the gods gods. So therefore, when the Muslims attack us on you know, the September 11th, they attack us because Wall Street is the center of stealing, and Pentagon is the center of killing in order to steal, and the White House, which they wanted to attack, is the center of the lying about the stealing and the killing, so that we don't even know that we are killing and stealing. So even in these holy places, I have never heard in all these years, you know, last year, 8 years or whatever, that we killed 1 million people in Iraq. And nobody has anything to do with it. If I would go to confession here, I would say I have paid immense amount of taxes in order to kill 1 million people in Iraq and 10,000 in Afghanistan. Does anybody confess this? I think Father Ken would be amazed if somebody would come in there and said, I've murdered. Nobody says it. And therefore, nobody says it, because Gracian in the 13th century decided that if the king said, these are the enemies, Carl Schmitt says politics is the art of identifying the enemy. If he's identified the enemy, you can kill him. You don't sin. You don't even have to go to confession.
Who made that position?
Carl Schmitt.
Oh, Carl Schmitt.
Yeah, Carl Schmitt was Hitler's jurist. He was Hitler's political theologian. So, yeah. Okay, so but just that we have that in our ear there, what absolute ethics means, because that is behind that document. There's behind these encyclical letters. That's behind the pathos, you know, of the Pope, when he stands there as the main teacher of Roman Catholicism and so on. And everybody's supposed to accept this. You shall not make yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything in heaven and on earth, beneath or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, Yahweh, your God, am a jealous God, and I punish the father's fault in the sons, the grandsons, and the great-grandsons of those who hate me. But I show kindness to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. And then the same thing with the name of God and so on. So here you also have this unbelievable thing, namely the theodicy, namely retaliation theodicy. That means when something bad happens to us, then this is the punishment for secret sins which we have committed, which is a very archaic type of thing. And our right-wing ministers and the evangelists, the 700 Club and so on, he did that September 11th. He said that this was the punishment for our homosexuality, our lesbianism and all that. And he repeated again with Haiti that this happened to the people in Haiti, that earthquake, because they liberated themselves from the French in 1806. And so slaves or workers or serfs are not supposed to free themselves, in spite of the fact that the Jews were freed from slavery according to Yahweh. They forget all this. But this is very strong in people, and it is in all world religions to some extent. So Antigone, for instance, says that is how we know how much we have sinned from how much we suffer. So, this here is one of the sources of this, you know. And if you challenge this, you know, then the Pope would say, you know, you are relativist. You have become a liberal. You are not a good Catholic. You're not a Catholic anymore. Walter?
Well, you know, what's interesting about Haiti's liberation in 1806 against Napoleon's troops